Her bare feet tore through the dry grass. Every step was a fresh cut, a new trail of blood left behind on the unforgiving earth. Clara was running for her life. The dress on her back, or what was left of it, hung in tatters, ripped to shreds by the same men who had beaten her body black and blue. She gasped for air, but each breath was a razor blade in her lungs. The sun beat down on the Wild West plain, a cruel, unblinking eye in a bleached white sky. Dust and sweat made a mask of grime on her face, and far behind her, carried on the wind, she could hear it, a sound worse than any gunshot. Laughter, the cruel, mocking laughter of men who would rather see her dead than see her free. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down her final seconds. She stumbled, her knees scraping raw against the hard-packed dirt. But the pain was a distant thing now, a dull echo. What really hurt was the cold, heavy stone of hopelessness in her gut. There was no escape. Not for a girl like her, sold like cattle, used like property. Her spirit was cracked, ready to shatter. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if they caught her again, she would not live to see the dawn. Then she saw it. A silver ribbon cutting through the brown landscape. Water. A narrow river, shimmering under the brutal sun. A ghost of a word escaped her cracked lips. Maybe. Maybe she could lose them in the current. Maybe the water could wash her away, make her disappear for good. That thought gave her a new burst of strength. She ran harder, the tattered remnants of her dress flapping behind her like broken wings. She reached the riverbank and didn't hesitate for a single second. She threw herself into the water, and the shock of the cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing into her skin. The current was strong, a greedy hand pulling her down, soaking the last shreds of her clothing until she felt utterly naked, utterly exposed. She fought to keep her head above the surface, her arms feeling like lead weights. Her vision blurred with tears and river water. She thought of her mother gone for so long. She thought of a life before she was sold, and then she thought of death. Maybe it was better this way, better than being dragged back to that house, back to that torment. She was ready to let go. And then her eyes shot open. Through the watery haze, she saw a figure on the bank. A man on a horse, broad-shouldered, with gray hair peeking out from under a worn hat. The horse moved slowly, deliberately, its hooves crushing the dry grass. Clara went rigid with terror. It was one of them. It had to be. One of the men who had beaten her, who had laughed as she bled. Her heart, which had been pounding so fiercely, seemed to stop altogether. It plunged into the depths of her despair. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. She hugged her arms to her chest, a useless gesture of modesty, shivering from cold and from pure animal fear. The water lapped at her bruised shoulders, washing away the blood. Her voice was a broken, ragged thing when she finally cried out, "Just kill me fast!" The words hung in the empty air, raw and final. Tears she didn't know she had left streamed down her face. I would rather die than go back. The rider pulled on the reins. The horse stopped just feet from the water's edge. The man leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at her. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't bark an order. He just stared. Silent. Motionless. And the look in his eyes wasn't the cruel glare of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. It was something else entirely. Something Clara couldn't understand. Something that made no sense. He looked at her as if he'd just seen a ghost. The old rancher sat on his horse, his gaze locked on the girl shivering in the river. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he swung a leg over and slid down from the saddle, his boots landing softly in the dust. He took a slow step toward the water. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I ain't here to hurt you." Clara's lips trembled. She hugged herself tighter, trying to disappear, trying to cover the evidence of her shame. Her eyes darted left and right, still expecting the rest of the hunting party to burst from the brush. But there was only this man, this stranger with gray hair and a face carved from granite. There was a strange quality to his voice. It wasn't gentle, not exactly, but it wasn't cruel either. It was just steady. He crouched at the river's edge, his knees cracking. "What happened to you, girl?" At first, the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight with fear. Then, like a dam breaking, the story poured out of her. She told him everything. About the house in town, about being bought and sold like a sack of flour, about the men she was expected to serve, and about what happened when she refused. She told him how they beat her each time she said no, how the pain was meant to break her, to grind her down until nothing was left. So tonight, she ran. She ran with no destination, no plan. She just ran, not caring if she lived to see another day. The man listened, his expression unreadable. His name was Ethan Cole, though she didn't know it yet. And as he listened, a storm was brewing behind his eyes. Because he wasn't just some rancher. He had a past, a dark one. Years ago, Ethan Cole wasn't a man who saved girls like Clara. He was the man who broke them. He'd run one of the most notorious houses on the frontier, making his fortune from the misery of others. He'd lived a life steeped in sin, until that sin came back to claim its due. He'd had a daughter once, his only child. She was about Clara's age when a rival gang took her as payback. When he found out they'd killed her, something inside Ethan shattered into a million pieces. He walked away from that filthy trade and never looked back, swearing an oath to God he'd never touch it again. He'd spent the years since then alone on his ranch, raising horses and trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. And as Clara's story spilled out, raw and painful, it was like hearing the ghost of his own daughter crying out for help. The old guilt, a weight he carried every single day, pressed down on him, stealing his breath. He knew what those men were capable of. He knew it all too well. Clara wiped her eyes with a shaking hand. "I should have died out there," she whispered. "They won't stop. They'll never stop until they drag me back." Ethan stared at her, at this broken girl who looked so much like the daughter he'd lost. His weathered face was a mask, but when he spoke, his voice was low and hard as iron. "Not if I got anything to say about it." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a tiny, fragile flicker of something stirred in Clara's chest. Hope. But out here, hope was a dangerous thing. It could get you killed faster than a bullet, because Ethan had just made a choice. He'd drawn a line in the sand. And when word got back to town that Ethan Cole was harboring a runaway, trouble wouldn't just be coming. It would be coming with guns. And when they came knocking, what would this old man, haunted by his past, really be willing to sacrifice for a stranger? The ranch was quiet that night. Too quiet. Ethan had given Clara a clean blanket and a spot in the barn. She was finally asleep, her face pale and still in the flickering lantern light. He watched her for a moment, the ache in his chest growing sharper. He sat on a stool just outside the barn door, the familiar weight of his old Colt revolver in his hands. He cleaned it methodically, an old ritual he thought he'd left behind forever. The night air was still, the kind of heavy stillness that comes before a storm, the kind that makes the hairs on a man's arms stand up. Then he heard it, the sound of hooves, not fast, slow, deliberate, the crunch of dry earth under iron horseshoes. Ethan set the revolver down and stood up, melting into the shadows beside the barn. Two riders came into view, stopping just outside his gate. Their shapes were hard silhouettes against the moonlit sky. One of them had a jagged scar that ran from his ear down to his jaw. The other was chewing on a toothpick, and he spat it into the dirt as he laid eyes on Ethan. "Evening, old man," the scarred one said, his voice laced with casual menace. We hear you might be holding on to something that don't belong to you. Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides, his body relaxed, betraying none of the tension coiling in his stomach. Don't know what you're talking about. The man with the toothpick let out a short, ugly laugh. A little filly. Ran off from the house in town. You know how it is. Girls get foolish ideas. Boss wants her back. Can't have the others thinking they can just run off. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. I reckon you boys ought to just ride on out of here. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle, his hand drifting down toward the pistol on his hip. You forget who you're talking to, old-timer. We know who you are, Cole. We remember when you ran the finest house this side of the territories. You think hiding one little stray is going to wash away all that sin? A fire ignited in Ethan's eyes. He took one slow step out of the shadows. His hand moved in a blur, and suddenly the Colt was in his fist, the metal glinting in the moonlight. He cocked the hammer, and the sound, a sharp, definitive click, echoed in the unnatural quiet. I said, he repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, ride out. The toothpick man's grin vanished. The two riders exchanged a nervous glance. They knew the legends. Ethan Cole wasn't just some broken-down rancher. He'd been a viper in his day, and a viper's fangs never truly lose their venom. The scarred man spat into the dirt again, a gesture of defiance that didn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. This ain't over, Cole. He yanked hard on his reins, and the two horses wheeled around, their hooves kicking up dust as they galloped away into the darkness. Ethan stood there, the revolver held steady, until the sound of their retreat faded completely. Only then did he lower the gun, his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He knew this was just the beginning. A warning shot. Next time they wouldn't come with questions. They'd come with rifles, and they'd bring enough men to burn his ranch to the ground. Inside the barn, Clara stirred in her sleep, blissfully unaware of how close death had just come. Ethan knew he couldn't protect her here. Not alone. He needed help. But the only person he could turn to was a man even more dangerous than the ones who were hunting her. A man from his past he had sworn he would never see again. This man was a king in the criminal underworld, and asking him for a favor was like making a deal with the devil himself. Ethan didn't sleep a wink that night. He sat on his porch, the revolver across his lap, watching the shadows dance as the moon made its slow journey across the sky. The memory of those two riders was a fresh wound. They'd be back. He knew it in his bones. And they'd bring an army with them. When morning came, Clara was awake and pacing, her fear a restless energy. I have to keep running, she said, her eyes wide and haunted. They'll find me here. Ethan shook his head, his face grim. Running won't do you any good. They'll track you to the ends of the earth. There's only one way to stop this. He stood up, his decision made. There's a man in town. His name is Harlan Briggs. Just saying the name felt like poison on his tongue. Back in the old days, Ethan and Harlan had run this territory together. Harlan was smart, ruthless, and most importantly, powerful. He owned the town, from the mayor to the sheriff. If Harlan Briggs declared a girl untouchable, not even the devil himself would dare to lay a hand on her. He saddled his fastest horse and helped Clara climb up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her small frame trembling as they set off across the open plains. The sky above was vast and blue, but to Ethan, it felt like the walls were closing in. Every single hoofbeat was a drum, pounding out a rhythm that spelled his name. His past was catching up, and it was running faster than any horse. By noon, they reached the town. It was a chaotic mess of wagons, traders, and drunks stumbling out of saloons. Ethan navigated the crowded streets, his eyes constantly scanning, looking for threats. He led the horse down a narrow, dirty alley to a large, unmarked brick building. No sign hung above the door, but every soul in this town knew who held court inside. This was Harlan's throne room. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Men with cold eyes played cards at rickety tables, their conversations dying as soon as they saw Ethan's face. It had been years, but the name Ethan Cole still carried the weight of a tombstone. Clara stuck close behind him, her gaze darting nervously into every dark corner. At the far end of the room, sitting in a large carved wooden chair, was Harlan Briggs. His hair was silver now, but his shoulders were still broad, his frame still powerful. And his eyes, they were as sharp and deadly as ever. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face as he saw Ethan. "Well, well, if it ain't Ethan Cole, I heard you'd gone and died." Ethan stopped in front of the table, standing tall. "I need your help, Harlan." He gestured back at Clara. "There's a girl. They won't let her go." Harlan leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked Clara up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "And why in the hell should I care about one runaway girl? You think you can just disappear for a decade, then walk back in here asking for favors?" The entire room went silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of a fly. Ethan didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but carrying across the room. "Because you owe me, Harlan." He held Harlan's gaze, his eyes like chips of ice. "And you damn well know it." The grin on Harlan's face vanished. He leaned forward, his expression hardening, his fingers drumming a soft, menacing rhythm on the tabletop. The men around the room shifted in their seats, their hands moving closer to their guns. For a long, tense moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion. Then Harlan let out a short, harsh laugh. "All right, Cole, I'll listen." His eyes flickered to Clara, then back to Ethan, a dangerous glint in their depths. "But what I decide to do with you, and that girl, well, that depends entirely on what this debt of mine is really worth." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Harlan wasn't offering help. He was negotiating a price, and in his world, the price was always paid in blood. The tension in the room was a physical thing, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Ethan stood his ground, a lone rock against the tide of Harlan's power. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the two old predators stared each other down. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, Harlan broke the silence. "All right, Cole. You win." He waved a dismissive hand. "I'll put the word out. The girl is off limits. But this," he said, pointing a thick finger at Ethan, "this clears the slate. You and me, we're done. You ever show your face in my town again, I'll have you shot." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled. Clara's knees washed over her. For the first time since she'd scrambled out of that window, she felt like she could actually breathe. The heavy chains of fear that had been wrapped around her chest seemed to loosen. Ethan just gave a single curt nod. He knew Harlan's promise wasn't born from kindness. It was a business transaction, a debt being settled. But sometimes, business was enough. It was enough for Clara to start dreaming of a life that wasn't lived in the shadows. It was enough for Ethan to allow himself a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, his past sins didn't have to define his future. As they stepped back out into the dusty, sun-bleached street, Clara turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why did you help me?" Ethan looked down at her, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened, just for a second. His voice, however, remained rough as gravel. "Because I once lost someone like you," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let it happen again." They rode back to the ranch as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery streaks of red and gold. Clara leaned against Ethan's back, her breathing finally calm and steady. For Ethan, the simple sound of her peace was worth more than all the gold he'd ever accumulated in his dark, previous life. But he knew this peace was fragile, a glass sculpture in a world of hammers. The Wild West never let a man rest for long. Out here, trouble was always just over the next rise, waiting. But for tonight, saving one broken soul felt like enough. It was enough to quiet the ghosts that haunted his every waking moment, if only for a little while. But as they rode, a new, colder fear began to creep into Ethan's heart. Harland had agreed too easily. Old debts meant nothing to a man like Harlan Briggs. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He had walked into the lion's den and asked for a favor. He was starting to realize the lion had only let him leave so it could follow him home. That night, Ethan didn't even try to sleep. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, every sense on high alert. The peace he'd felt riding back from town had evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Harlan Briggs wasn't a man who let old debts go. He was a man who buried them, along with anyone who tried to collect. Clara was asleep in the small spare room of his cabin, not the barn. He'd insisted. He was trying to give her a sliver of normalcy, a moment of safety, but he knew it was a lie. This little ranch wasn't a sanctuary. It was a target. Around midnight, his horse in the corral started acting skittish, snorting and stamping its feet. Ethan stood up, his hand tightening on the rifle. He slipped around the side of the cabin, using the deep shadows as cover. And then he saw it. A single rider, sitting on his horse on the ridge overlooking the ranch. The man was just watching, waiting, a vulture circling its prey. It wasn't one of the two thugs from before. This man sat his horse with a stillness, a deadly patience that spoke of a professional. Harland hadn't just called off the dogs. He'd sent a wolf. Ethan's blood ran cold. This changed everything. This wasn't about retrieving property anymore. This was an execution. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. He had to get Clara away now under the cover of darkness. He crept back inside and gently shook her awake. "Get your things," he whispered, his voice urgent. "We have to leave. Now." Fear flashed in her eyes, but she didn't question him. She simply nodded, her trust in him absolute. While she gathered the few meager belongings she had, Ethan scribbled a quick note, leaving it on the table. Then he grabbed a spare rifle, a sack of ammunition, and a canteen of water. They slipped out the back door and made their way to the corral. As Ethan saddled the horses, his eyes kept darting back to the figure on the ridge. The man hadn't moved. He was just watching. It was a game of cat and mouse, and the man on the ridge was enjoying it. He wanted them to run. The hunt was the sport. With Clara mounted behind him, they rode out, not toward the road, but deep into the rugged, unforgiving Badlands. The terrain was treacherous, especially in the dark, but it offered cover. As they disappeared into a narrow canyon, Ethan risked a glance back. The figure on the ridge was gone. But Ethan knew he wasn't alone. The hunt had begun. They were no longer just running from a couple of hired thugs. They were being pursued by one of Harlan's own personal killers, and out here, in the vast, empty wilderness, there was nowhere to hide. The man wasn't just following them, he was hurting them, pushing them deeper into territory where the law didn't exist and screams went unheard. Ethan realized with a sickening certainty that Harlan's promise wasn't just a lie. It was a death sentence. He hadn't agreed to protect Clara. He had agreed to bury her, and Ethan Cole right along with her. They rode for hours, the moon their only guide. The silence of the Badlands was absolute, broken only by the clatter of hooves on rock and the sound of their own ragged breathing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name. Ethan pushed the horse hard, his instincts screaming at him that they were still being watched. Just before dawn, they found a small, hidden spring nestled in a rocky alcove. It was a defensible position, offering a clear view of the surrounding area. "We rest here," Ethan said, sliding off the horse. His muscles ached, but the adrenaline kept him going. Clara was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear, her resolve firm. She was no longer the terrified girl he'd pulled from the river. The fire was back in her spirit. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. "We turn the tables," Ethan replied, his voice grim. "He's hunting us, so we're going to hunt him." This was a world Ethan knew. He'd spent his youth tracking men through these very same canyons. The killer Harlan sent might be good, but Ethan was better. He was on his home turf. He handed Clara a pistol. "You know how to use one of these?" She shook her head. "Then you're about to learn." He spent a precious few minutes showing her the basics. How to load, how to aim, how to fire. "Only use it if he gets past me. Understand?" She nodded, her hands surprisingly steady as she took the heavy weapon. Ethan then took his rifle and climbed up the rocks, finding a vantage point that gave him a perfect view of the canyon trail they'd just used. He settled in, his body becoming one with the stone, and he waited. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the rocks. Ethan remained perfectly still, his patience a weapon in itself. Then he saw him, a lone rider, moving slowly, cautiously up the trail. He was good, Ethan had to give him that. He moved like a ghost, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks around him. But he wasn't good enough. Ethan raised his rifle, the stock settling comfortably against his shoulder. He lined up the sights, centering them on the man's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end this right here, right now. One shot, and they would be free. But something stopped him. It wasn't mercy. It was a cold, hard realization. Killing this man wouldn't solve the problem. Harlan would just send another. And another. There was only one way to end this, for good. He had to go after the man at the top of the food chain. He had to go after Harlan Briggs. But that was a suicide mission. Harlan was untouchable, surrounded by an army of loyal killers in his fortress of a saloon. To get to him, Ethan would need something more than a gun. He would need leverage, something he could use to tear Harlan's empire down from the inside. A memory sparked in the back of his mind. A secret. A dark secret that only he and Harlan shared. A crime they had committed together years ago, a crime so terrible that if it ever came to light, it would destroy Harlan completely. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only card he had left to play. He lowered the rifle. He wasn't going to kill this assassin. He was going to capture him. He was going to make him talk. He needed to know Harlan's weaknesses, the cracks in his fortress walls. The game had just changed. This was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance. Ethan was done running from his past. He was about to drag it out into the light, and Harlan Briggs with it. The ghost of Ethan Cole was about to come back to life, and he was coming for blood. Ethan didn't fire. He watched as the assassin got closer, his eyes like a hawk's, searching for any sign of his prey. Ethan had set a simple trap. A tripwire made from a thin piece of leather connected to a pile of loose rocks on the ledge above the trail. It was an old trick, but effective. The assassin's horse stepped over the wire. The rocks came crashing down. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it startled the horse, which reared up, throwing the rider to the ground. Before the man could recover, Ethan was on him, the butt of his rifle connecting with the side of the man's head. The assassin crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Ethan dragged the man back to the alcove, binding his hands and feet securely. Clara watched, her eyes wide, a mixture of fear and awe on her face. When the man came to, Ethan was crouched in front of him, his face a cold, hard mask. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. The man just spat at him. "Go to hell, Cole." Ethan smiled, a cold, humorless thing. "I've already been. I'm here to return the favor to Harlan." He pressed the barrel of his pistol against the man's forehead. "You're going to tell me everything." How many men does Harland keep at the saloon? What are the patrol schedules? Where does he sleep? The assassin's eyes widened in fear. He was a killer, but he wasn't a fool. He knew he was a dead man either way. But death at Ethan's hands would be slow and painful. He started talking. For the next hour, he spilled every secret he knew about Harland's operation. He described the layout of the saloon, the hidden tunnels underneath, the corrupt sheriff on Harland's payroll. He gave Ethan the keys to the kingdom. But then, he revealed something that made Ethan's blood turn to ice. "You're not the only one Harland wants dead," the assassin rasped. "There's a ledger, an old one. Harland's been trying to find it for years. He thinks you know where it is." Ethan stared at him, his mind reeling. The ledger. He knew exactly what the man was talking about. Years ago, before their partnership soured, he and Harland had kept a detailed record of all their illegal activities. Bribes, smuggling, murders, everything was in that book. It was their insurance policy against each other. They had agreed to destroy it, but Ethan, never fully trusting Harland, had hidden his copy instead. He'd buried it deep in the wilderness and forgotten about it. Until now. That ledger was the proof. It was the one thing that could bring Harland's entire criminal empire crashing down. It was the leverage he so desperately needed. "Where did you bury it, Cole?" the assassin sneered. "Harland will give you anything for that book. He'll even let the girl live." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Harland didn't just want him dead to settle an old score. He wanted him dead because he was a loose end. He was the only other person on Earth who knew about the ledger. And Clara. Clara wasn't the target. She was the bait. Harland knew that by helping her, Ethan would expose himself. He had used her to draw Ethan out of hiding. His attempt at redemption had walked him right into a trap that had been set for him years ago. Ethan stood up, his mind a whirlwind. He had to get that ledger. It was his only hope. But he knew with a chilling certainty that Harland would be thinking the same thing. It was a race to a forgotten grave where the sins of the past lay buried. And whoever got there first would hold the power to destroy the other. He looked at the bound assassin. He couldn't leave him here, but he couldn't take him with them. He made a hard choice. He gagged the man, ensuring he couldn't call for help, and left him tied up in the alcove. He'd be found eventually, or he wouldn't. Ethan didn't care. He turned to Clara. "We have to go back," he said, his voice strained. "There's something I have to get." The look in his eyes told her that this was about more than just them now. This was about settling a war that had started long before she was even born. They were no longer just running for their lives. They were riding straight into the heart of the storm. The place was a ghost of a memory. An old abandoned line shack where he and Harland used to meet, back when they were carving up the territory between them. It was half rotted now, the roof caved in, but Ethan knew the spot well. Under the hearthstone of the crumbling fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limit. The landscape blurred past them, a monotonous stretch of rock and scrub. Ethan's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts. He had underestimated Harland. He had let his guilt over his daughter cloud his judgment. He had walked into this blind, and now Clara was paying the price. They reached the shack just as dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. The place was silent, deserted. Ethan dismounted, his rifle at the ready. "Stay here," he told Clara. "Keep the horses ready. If you hear anything, you ride. Don't wait for me." She clutched the pistol he'd given her, her knuckles white. "Be careful," she whispered. He slipped inside the dilapidated structure. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. He went straight to the fireplace and began prying at the heavy hearthstone with the butt of his rifle. It was slow, hard work. The stone was heavy, settled deep into the earth. Finally, with a groan of protest, it shifted. He reached into the dark cavity beneath, and his fingers brushed against the familiar texture of the oilcloth package. Relief washed over him. He had it. He pulled the ledger out. And that's when he heard the click, the unmistakable sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. "I'll take that, Ethan." The voice came from the darkened doorway. Ethan froze, his hand still in the hole. He looked up slowly. Standing there, silhouetted against the dying light, was Harland Briggs himself. And he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a half-dozen of his men, all of them armed to the teeth. And standing next to Harland, a smug grin on his face, was the assassin Ethan had left tied up in the canyon. He must have had a hidden knife. Harland stepped into the shack, his eyes fixed on the ledger in Ethan's hand. "You always were sentimental, Ethan. I knew you wouldn't have destroyed it. Took my man here a while to break, but he eventually remembered this little love nest of ours. I figured you'd run here eventually." Ethan's mind raced, searching for an escape, an angle, anything. There was none. He was trapped. "It's over," Harland said, his voice soft, almost regretful. "Give me the book, and I'll make it quick for you and the girl." Ethan looked past Harland, through the doorway. He could see Clara, her face a mask of terror, a gun pointed at her head. They had her. His heart sank. He had failed. He had led her from one cage straight into another, bigger one. He had tried to be a savior, but all he'd managed to be was a fool. "The book, Ethan," Harland repeated, his patience wearing thin. Ethan looked down at the ledger in his hand. The record of a lifetime of sin, the key to his enemy's destruction, and the price of Clara's life. He was caught in an impossible choice. He could give Harland the book and condemn countless others to suffer under his rule, but maybe, just maybe, save Clara. Or he could defy him and watch her die right in front of him. The weight of his past and the future of this girl he had sworn to protect rested on his next move. And he had only seconds to decide. Ethan's knuckles were white as he clutched the ledger. He looked from the book to Harland's cold, triumphant face, then to Clara, her eyes pleading with him. In that moment, he saw his own daughter's face superimposed over hers, the same fear, the same helplessness, the same fate he had sworn he would never allow to happen again. He couldn't do it. He couldn't trade her life, not even for justice. Slowly, he held the ledger out. "Let her go first," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Let her ride away, and the book is yours." Harland chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan, you always were a soft touch. That's why I'm standing here and you're kneeling in the dirt." He gestured to one of his men. "Take the book." The man started forward, but Ethan snatched the ledger back. "She rides first, Harland, or I swear to God I'll throw this thing into the fire." He gestured to the crumbling fireplace behind him. It was a bluff. There was no fire, but it was all he had. Harland's eyes narrowed. He considered it for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Fine. Let her go." He turned to the man holding Clara. "Let her get on her horse, but if he tries anything, put a bullet in her back." The man released Clara, shoving her toward the horses. She stumbled, then ran, her eyes never leaving Ethan's. She scrambled onto her horse, her hands shaking as she grabbed the reins. "Go!" Ethan yelled. "Don't look back! Just ride!" For a second, she hesitated. Then, with a sob, she kicked the horse into a gallop, disappearing into the twilight. Ethan watched her go, a profound sense of relief mixing with the bitter taste of defeat. He had saved her. That's all that mattered. "A touching scene," Harland sneered. "Now, the book." Ethan turned back to him, his face set like stone. He held the ledger out. As Harland reached for it, Ethan's other hand shot out, not with a gun, but with a handful of dirt from the hole under the hearth. He flung it directly into Harland's face. Harland roared in surprise and pain, stumbling backward, clawing at his eyes. In that single moment of confusion, Ethan acted. He dove behind the crumbling fireplace, pulling his pistol as he went. The shack erupted in a hail of gunfire. Bullets splintered the old wood around him, kicking up clouds of dust. Ethan fired back blindly, not trying to hit anyone, just trying to create chaos. He knew he couldn't win. He was outgunned and surrounded. But he could buy time. Time for Clara to get away. He risked a peek over the stones. Harlan's men were advancing, using the walls of the shack for cover. Harlan himself was back on his feet, his face a mask of fury, wiping the dirt from his eyes. "Kill him!" he bellowed. "I want him dead!" Ethan fired again, forcing them back, but he was running out of bullets. He could hear the clicks of an empty chamber getting closer. This was it, the end of the line. He thought of his daughter. He thought of Clara riding free under the stars, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel regret. He had made a choice, a good one. He had finally done something right. He leaned his back against the fireplace, the ledger clutched to his chest, and prepared to make his final stand. Then he heard a new sound, a sound that didn't belong, the thunder of hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming fast. Harlan and his men heard it too. They stopped firing, their heads turning toward the sound. A confused murmur ran through them. "Who the hell is that?" one of them asked. A voice, clear and strong, cut through the night. "Harlan Briggs, this is Sheriff Miller. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." Ethan stared in disbelief. The sheriff? The one the assassin said was on Harlan's payroll? It didn't make any sense. Harlan looked stunned. Then his face twisted in a snarl of rage. "Miller! You double-crossing son of a bitch! I own you!" "Not anymore, Harlan," the sheriff's voice called back. "Seems a certain young lady rode into town screaming about how you and your men were about to murder an innocent man. Stirred up quite a hornet's nest. Turns out a lot of folks around here were just waiting for a reason to stand up to you." Clara. She hadn't run. She had ridden for help. She had saved him. A wave of hope, so powerful it almost knocked him over, surged through Ethan. It wasn't over. "This is your last chance, Harlan," the sheriff yelled. "Give it up." For a moment, there was silence. Then Harlan let out a wild, desperate laugh. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you all with me," he screamed, and started firing wildly into the darkness. The world exploded into chaos. The sheriff's posse returned fire, and the night was filled with the roar of guns and the shouts of dying men. Ethan saw his chance. In the confusion, he scrambled out from behind the fireplace and ran for the back of the shack, where a section of the wall had rotted away. He burst out into the open and ran for the cover of the rocks, the ledger still clutched in his hand. He didn't look back. The firefight raged behind him, a symphony of destruction that signaled the end of Harlan Briggs's reign of terror. Ethan kept running, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, until he could run no more. He collapsed behind a large boulder, gasping for air. He was alive, he was free, and he still had the book. After a long while, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was more profound than any noise. Ethan waited, his heart pounding, until he saw the flicker of lanterns approaching. It was the sheriff and a few of his men. "Cole?" the sheriff called out. "You out here?" Ethan stood up slowly. "I'm here." The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a kind face, walked up to him. He looked at the ledger in Ethan's hand and gave a slow nod. "I reckon this is what all the fuss was about." "It is," Ethan said. He held it out. "It's all in there, everything he ever did." The sheriff took the book. "This will be enough to clean out every last rat in this territory. You've done a good thing, Ethan." He paused, a sad look in his eyes. "I'm sorry about Harlan. I should have stood up to him years ago." "What happened?" Ethan asked. "He tried to make a run for it. Didn't get far." The sheriff didn't need to say any more. A moment later, Clara appeared, her face streaked with tears and dust. She ran to Ethan, throwing her arms around him. He held her tight, a feeling of warmth spreading through his chest that he thought he would never feel again. "You came back," he whispered. "I couldn't leave you." she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. You didn't leave me. They stood there for a long moment, two survivors in the quiet aftermath of a war. The reign of Harlan Briggs was over. The town was free. And so were they. In the days that followed, the sheriff used the ledger to dismantle Harlan's entire network. The corrupt officials, the hired guns, the whole rotten system came crashing down. Justice, swift and final, had come to the territory. Ethan and Clara stayed at the ranch, healing. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were quieter now, fainter. One morning, as they watched the sunrise paint the sky, Ethan turned to her. There's something I have to do, he said. Something I should have done a long time ago. There's a chance, a small one, that my daughter might still be alive. The sheriff found a name in that ledger. A preacher who ran a secret network helping girls escape. My daughter's name was in it. It gave a location, a convent way out west. He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, fragile hope. I have to go. I have to know. Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. You're not going alone, she said. And so they rode out together, not running from a dark past, but riding toward a bright, uncertain future. They were no longer a broken old man and a runaway girl. They were a family, forged in fire and fear, bound by a shared hope for a second chance. The road ahead was long, but for the first time they weren't traveling it alone. If you enjoyed this story and believe that everyone deserves a shot at redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It lets me know you're out there and keeps these stories coming. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time,